Hello everyone and welcome to today's Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris and the topic of today's masterclass is Will you or won't you? The challenge of future forms in English. We've chosen this topic today because we believe it's one of the most challenging areas both for language teachers and their learners. So let me give you a little idea of some of the points that we will be covering in this masterclass. I'm going to begin with a quiz for us to actually consider whether will is the most appropriate future form for the example sentences that you'll be seeing on screen. We will then look at some of the reasons why will tends to be overused by both teachers and learners. And then I'd like to allow you to take part in a short demonstration of two often quite easily confused future forms. We'll then move on to look at what I believe is the key idea when teaching futurity, that we should look at function, the meaning of the future form, and teach meaning, not the grammatical forms themselves, as the way into the target language. And then towards the end of the masterclass, I'll look briefly at the differences between inductive and deductive learning, explaining that inductive learning, which has been very popular recently, may in fact not be the best way to teach future forms, particularly at lower levels, before giving you a schematic which will allow you to see all of the future forms, or most of them, in their full glory before coming to some conclusions. So let's start by looking at this quiz. You're going to see shortly on screen 3 sentences, and each one has an option: will as the future form or something else. And I'd like you just to take some time as you look at them to decide, is will or the other version the more appropriate and the more natural? And here they are. So in the first one, we've got the train will leave at 14:07, or the train leaves at 14:07. Which do you think is more appropriate, will leave or leave? And then the same for number 2, and then for number 3. So I'll pause now to give you some time to decide which you prefer. And of course, if you would like to, you're welcome to put in some comments here into chat. Okay, so these are what I consider to be the more natural versions of the future form. So rather than using will, you'll see that we have different forms for both 1, 2, and 3. The present simple for number 1, going to future in number 2, and then the present continuous in number 3. You'll notice here that I'm using grammatical terminology. And in fact, that is not the way to do it. Really, what we should be doing at this stage is talking about timetable futures, plans, and fixed arrangements as an explanation for the choice of form in these 3 sentences, which is what we will be looking at throughout this masterclass. So why is it then that so many people, be they teachers or language learners, tend to move to the form will rather than any of the other alternatives when particularly, I think, speaking English and therefore communicating ideas in real time? There are a number of reasons, and they are here on screen. Futurity is intrinsically difficult. More of that in a few moments. But I think there are other reasons why students, and by students I mean both students in the classroom, but also teachers, because of course as teachers we are all also students of the English language, can get confused. This may well relate to confusing meta-language. There may well be language that the students haven't studied yet. They simply don't know how to express the idea, a developmental error. There may well be a real-time slip. the student knows the language, but just in the desire to communicate in real time gets it wrong. But I think we also need to consider the possibilities at times of poor teaching and take responsibility ourselves as teachers. But also here I might include some course books, plus that common problem of fossilization. Your learner has got to a point in their English language learning where a mistake is in place and they are struggling to overcome it. It's solidified, it's fossilized. Going back to this first point of intrinsically difficult, I'd like to share with you a quotation from Michael Lewis, writing in the 1980s in his book, The English Verb, An Exploration of Structure and Meaning. And I think he has some very interesting things to say about futurity. And the quotation is coming up on the next slide. Rather than reading it aloud for you, because of course you're all good readers of English, I'm just going to pause to give you some time to read and think about what we see here on screen. And there are, I think, a number of very interesting points here. Number one, the point that we often overlook is that there is no formal future tense in English. English really only has two tenses, the present simple and the simple past. Morphological changes. Will is a form of compounding and is seen as a form, a verb form, rather than as a tense, strictly speaking. But I think more importantly here is the point that is made that it's not possible to give simple, easily accessible, comprehensive rules. That's why it makes it, I think, intrinsically difficult. But also the fact that there is this reference here to speaker's choice. And in the verb forms that you're going to see shortly in the short demo, you're going to see very definitely how it may well be that the choice of tense is informed as much by the perspective of the speaker on the future event than anything intrinsic to that event itself. I'll explain that when we come to it. So, with that in mind, let's move forward and start thinking about fixed plans and intentions. I'm going to share with you now a series of photographs. So here are the 4 pictures. And as I say, your job is to put them in order based on the order in which you hear them spoken about in a few moments. The first 2 pictures will be less clear. A is a photograph of a friend of mine. Her name is Ellis. She's a fashion journalist. Picture B is a private school in Athens. C, I think, will be more familiar to you, the Acropolis in Athens, and D, a map of Athens itself. And as I say, your job is to put these in order as you hear them from the following text, which I will read to you now. I'm really excited as I'm about to travel to mainland Greece for a teacher training trip. It's been confirmed that I'm delivering sessions at a private school in Athens for a couple of days at the beginning of the month. I'm also going to see my friend Ellis, who is a fashion journalist, and she's going to take me to visit the Parthenon, but I'm not sure exactly when yet. So based on that recording you just heard, which was the first picture? Which was the second, the third, and the fourth? If you'd like to put the order of the pictures into chat now, that would be really helpful. And I'll pause a few moments for you to be able to do so. Okay, so here we go. The first picture I talked about was the map of Greece, followed by the image of the school, then my friend Alice, and then finally this temple in Athens itself. So what's actually happening in this demo lesson? I'm just going to pause the lesson now to share with you the steps of this lesson on futurity and two of the future forms. So the first task, the one that you've just done, was a gist task. I asked you to listen to the text and to be able to put the pictures in order. Notice here, there is no discussion of grammar at all. This is entirely meaning focused, and that is deliberate. When we're teaching verb forms or tenses, we should really be focusing on the meaning before the name of the tense. Our next step, which we'll do together, is for me to talk about the grammar dictation which follows. So you've heard the text for the first time. What will then follow, we won't do it completely, time is against us, but I would encourage, if you were teaching this lesson, to do a grammar dictation, again with questions that are meaning focused. Once those meaning focused questions have been answered by the class, you can then for reinforcement, carry on with a meaning focused gap fill to discriminate between the two future forms, or if you like, and this is what you'll see coming up in a few moments, you can go straight to a meaning focused activation task. So let's have a look at the second stage, the grammar dictation. Here is the text that I read to you, and in a class, if time permitted, what I would do is do this as a grammar dictation. I would read you the text a number of times and ask you as learners to dictate what you hear. You can do this sentence by sentence, or if you're wanting to challenge the students more, you could do this as a full dictation at full speed, and then the students collaborate to put the text back together again. If you're working with lower level students, and this is the first time that they've been exposed to the two future forms here, you may want to do it sentence by sentence so that the students are able to really tune into each sentence and its meaning one by one. It might be too much of a challenge to do it as a full speed dictation. Okay, so you'll notice that next to the future forms are some numbers. And these numbers relate to the questions which follow. In other words, there's going to be a question about, number one, about to travel, and then a meaning-focused question about I'm delivering, going to see, and then for going to take me. And here are our meaning-focused questions. When is the author's Greece trip? In the close or distant future? And what phrase expresses this? Number 2 and number 3 focus on the certainty or the planned nature of the activities in 2, 3, and in fact 4. In other words, is certainty related to a form like I'm delivering, or is that a plan, or is a plan related to going to? Again, the students here are really thinking about the expression, the communication of functional ideas. How do we express an activity in the future that is certain and in the diary? And we contrast that with an activity that we've perhaps talked about with a friend, we've planned, but the time frame, exactly when it takes place, hasn't been confirmed yet. Already, you're going to, I think, notice one of the problems that was highlighted in a few slides ago, that of our meta language. Words like plan, intention, fixed plan, arrangement, they tend to kind of overlap to some extent. And this is one of the issues with the future form teaching, that of having clear meta language, which we and our students are familiar with, but also at the same time, the fact that this relates to an uncertain activity, because the future is itself, by definition, not absolutely certain. It's not happened yet, but nevertheless, within that, we have shades of meaning. So hopefully, at the end of this grammar dictation activity, the students are aware that number 2, I am delivering, is more fixed, more certain than 3 and 4, where we have going to in the structure. So what is emerging for them is an understanding that going to talks about ideas which are in discussion, but I'm ing talks about something that perhaps is fixed at a time and a date in the diary. Moving on to what we can do then is an activation activity, or we could have a sandwich with a gap fill beforehand if you like. I've jumped straight through to this focus on the students activating the language in some kind of personalization task. What are you about to do in the near future? What fixed diary arrangements do you and your partner have, encouraging the students to work in pairs, to share information? I'm having dinner with my cousins on Friday. I'm going to visit another city sometime later in the month. I don't know when yet, and so on. So as we've gone through that short demo, what I hope will be clear is that at all times we've really been foregrounding the importance of the function of the language, its meaning. This is something I want to come and talk about in a little bit more detail now. So just to clarify, we're all in agreement here. A quick matching activity for you. This recycles the language that you have just seen. What do we use if we are talking about the near future? As a vocabulary phrase, number 1, match it A, B, and C. Our fixed plans, A, B, and C, and our future intentions, A, B, or C. And if you'd like to have a quick think about how you would match those 3 functions with their form, that would be great. And I'll pause here for a few moments for you to be able to do so. Hopefully then, you've decided that when we talk about the near future using lexical items, about to, we're talking about something that's in the near future. And by near, this is in the perception of the speaker. It is not defined by the number of minutes. It's defined by the time frame that the speaker gives. Again, choice. So you've probably noticed that my visit to Greece is not in the month of this recording, but the following month. But nevertheless, as I look at my year, and I tend to think about teacher training in yearly periods, for me, that is the near future. So I'm able to use about to go to Greece. Because I have a schedule that's been given to me of the different schools that I'm visiting, and it's in my diary and I even know the time, I am delivering, for me, is the right form for my fixed diary event, number 2. Whereas Ellis, seeing her on the visit to the Parthenon, I'm not quite sure yet when that's happening. It's towards the end of the week or the 11 days that I'm in Greece. It might be on a Saturday, it might be on a Sunday, might even be on a Friday, I'm not sure. It's my intention for Ellis and me to meet up. We just have to finalise nearer the time exactly when that will be. Now, this is important because if we go back to what Michael Lewis was saying about meaning being to do with choice, notice, therefore, how this is a question of perception. I am a fairly detailed person, and in that respect, I'm like my mother. So It's not until I've got a date and a time and a confirmation that I put something into my diary, and I'm then able to talk about it in terms of I am plus verb ing. I'm delivering. I'm visiting Paphos. I'm visiting Thessaloniki. I know the days that these are happening, so I'm able to use this idea of a fixed event. However, other people may be slightly more relaxed in terms of their focus on time. It's just enough to know that it's been talked about. This is perhaps my father. So my mother and my father could both be talking about the same event, but refer to it in different future forms in order to express their perception of that event. So, to give you an example, my mother might say, "Oh, I'm going to have lunch with friends sometime next week." Whereas for my father, he's had the conversation with his mates and therefore knows for certain, in far as he's concerned, they're good for their word. And he might say, "I'm having lunch with my friends next week." Same event, but because for my mother, the time hasn't been finalized, it's still a future intention. So she uses going to, whereas for my father, it's enough to have had the first conversation for him to be able to say, "I'm having." So notice here that we are talking about the grammar of choice, not fixed grammar rules. And as I was preparing this webinar and looking at the dictation, it occurred to me just how close this is as an activity to the ones that are recommended by Richard Chin and Danny Norrington Davis in their books, From Rules to Reason, which was a gallery teachers masterclass in October, November 2022. And do please have a look at that, because the point that was made in that gallery teachers webinar is that for students to be able to understand grammar, we need ideally to go beyond the rule to look at the reason why a speaker has chosen a particular grammatical form. And I think this is a lovely example when we're looking at Futurity, at just how helpful that look at the meaning and what the speaker was thinking is a more helpful way in than just giving the students a list of rules and telling them to follow them. So in some form of summary of the points made so far, therefore, I think I'm a great believer in sharing learning outcomes with learners. But when we share the learning outcomes, I think we should do this as they relate to the communicative function of the target language, focusing therefore on the meaning of the target language rather than the form. And therefore, as such, what we should be doing if we're having a lesson which contrasts to be plus verb ing with going to, that we don't tell the students at the beginning of the lesson, "Today we're going to be contrasting present continuous and going to for future meaning," because at the end of the day, that's not very exciting, is it? And students are already switched off. But instead, today we're going to be practicing talking about the future, and in particular, how can we express fixed diary arrangements, fixed plans, and compare those with our future intentions, and then maybe give an example. Okay. Those of you who are thinking deeply about this may already have noticed in what I've just said that there is a tension here between allowing the students to discover the language through language examples, and then with that, the tension of enabling students to understand the rules, particularly at a lower level. And I think at lower levels, there is an argument for some more rule-driven language teaching. And that is therefore what we're looking at in the next section, where we look at inductive and deductive language teaching. Just to give you a sort of a personal reflection on this, as we'll see from some of the examples on screen in a few moments, inductive materials have been around for a long time, but they've become more and more popular in course books. However, there is an argument that students at lower levels particularly can in fact do better when they are working with rules that are taught explicitly. And therefore, perhaps at lower levels, there is a way of mediating these two for success. And I'll look at that in a moment. But just to make sure that we are happy with these two sometimes slightly confusing forms, you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, inductive and two, deductive. And I'd like you to match 1 and 2, inductive and deductive, with the definitions of rules, followed by examples, followed by practice, and then B, examples which the learners use to work out the rules. Okay, so does inductive go with rules followed by examples and practice, or does it go with B, examples from which the learners work out the rules? And here's the answer. Inductive is where the students get given language data and then they work out the rules for themselves. And this can be guided by questions, much as we had in the grammar discovery. Whereas deductive, and we'll see an example in a few moments, is where the students are given the rules, they then look at some examples and they practice it. Here is an example of what I think is probably the most inductive grammar book that I've ever come across. It's called the Anti-Grammar Grammar Book, and it was published back in 1991. What you can see on this slide is some language examples, 1, 2, and 3, and then some guided discovery questions. It's a matching activity to help the students to develop for themselves an understanding of the language use. In that particular book, there are about 6 or 7 similar activities, and then at the end, the students look at a new set of language examples, all of which contain future forms: it'll, going to, I'm seeing, and then the students match them with the meanings here. And then what they then do is write out what the verb form is. So here it will be will plus bare infinitive, and they've got them, they match it with the uses or the meanings here. In course books, what we sometimes find is what I might call a bit of a fudge, a bit of a compromise. So this is taken from the 4th edition of one of the world's top-selling English language course books, OUP's English File. And what we seem to have is as an inductive approach. Students listen to an extract, they then, in fact, they're conversations between family members, and they match them 1, 2, 3 with the cartoons A, B, and C. They then listen again to the conversations, and they fill in the gaps with the target form. And then here is the grammar discovery element, the inductive part, where the students match the sentences with their meaning A to F. It does strike me at intermediate level that having 6 different meanings all at the same time is probably overload. You imagine that you could probably complete these activities in about 10 or 15 minutes. So what's interesting is when you're then asked to go to the grammar bank, where you have very detailed explanations of rules, which I think most students would take one look at and feel rather overwhelmed, followed by some language practice activities, controlled practice basically, circling the correct form here and filling in the responses with the correct future form here. Now, it seems to me that these pages 2 and 3 are much longer and much more detailed than the overview on, or the introduction of the language, the presentation of the language here. So although this pretends to be inductive, in fact, very quickly it turns into a deductive bit of language teaching. If we're talking about deductive approaches to language and grammar, then probably the best example I can think of is Murphy's famous English Grammar in Use series. And the way that works is that the language is presented on the right-hand side. The students don't really have to do anything. They're just given the rules, and then they practice them on the right-hand page. So what we have here is a clear example of deductive language teaching and learning. So why am I going into this in so much detail? Well, there has, as I say, been previously a very definite sense of inductive somehow being viewed to be best as an approach to language teaching. But in their recent work, Letherby, Main and Harries, and this is in their book, An Introduction to Evidence-Based Teaching in the English Language Classroom, research is showing that, in fact, for beginners, language is grasped better if it is presented clearly and transparently. In other words, direct instruction, deductive teaching. One of the reasons might be that the cognitive load that's associated with inductive learning, the amount of thinking that has to take place, can get in the way of the learning of the grammar at lower levels. The students are focusing so much on, well, what does that word mean? What does this word mean? Have to match the cartoons. Which one am I looking at? Oh, I'm not sure what's happening in this cartoon. That, in fact, there is so much else to think about that it gets in the way of actually getting to the point of the distinction between the fixed future activity and the future intention. Therefore, it might be the case that, or when I say it might be, it does really seem to be the case, that guided discovery as a way into language teaching is perhaps better for advanced learners, higher level learners. If you want to use it with your beginners, your elementaries and your pre-intermediates, then rather than using it as an introduction, a first view of the new language, it might well be better done for practice and recycling of material that they've seen previously, and they are now revisiting to help them to learn it and for it to become deep learning rather than surface level learning. Assuming, and I think it's fair and correct to do so, that for many of you, that you have good language levels, that you're able to work with inductive learning. The fact remains that Futurity, the different future forms, can be a bit sort of difficult and to remember what they all are. So as I come to the end of this masterclass, what I wanted to do was to give you some access to different ways of finding out about futurity in English. I like this one because, on the one hand, for higher level learners, like all of you as teachers, it summarizes in one place with clear reference to meaning a relationship with form, and then the name of the future form given here. I would not give this to most students. It'll be beyond them. They will not be able to make any sense of it, and for it to become part of their active language use if they are simply asked to learn this by rote. They need to experience the language and ideally get to grips with the reasons for the language rather than anything else. So if I go back to my point about how do we mediate the value of reason-based learning with lower levels, then I think perhaps what we can do is do the activity like the grammar dictation in English, and then decrease the load the cognitive load by putting those questions into L1 and then talking about the language in L1 with perhaps some overt teaching overlaying it. As you know, perhaps from previous Gallery Teachers Masterclasses, I'm a great fan of the use of L1 strategically. And this seems to me to be one way in which we can help our learners to come to grips with difficult ideas that help them to understand the reasons for language use, but which don't confuse them and therefore lead to poor learning. So to conclude, as you've seen, one of the struggles that I've had throughout this session is knowing how to talk about the future. You've seen fixed arrangements, but also the use of the word plan. And plan seems to be going in towards the territory of a future intention. And that was deliberate to make the point that it isn't easy. What we should be aiming for is to be careful in our use of meta language, the technical language of grammar, and be consistent so that your students really do share with you and each other an understanding of what it is that they are learning and what function they are aiming to use in English. As far as our learning outcomes are concerned, relate them to the communicative use, not the grammar label. So contrasting, talking about fixed future events rather than intentions, not present continuous and going to. But as I've demoed, I hope all the way through this masterclass, meaning first before form. Ensure that meaning, and this comes back to this idea of working with reasons, that it is supported by clear contextualization. You will have noticed, I think, in that grammar activity that I made it very clear with the going to forms. I actually said, this isn't certain yet. It frames the meaning nicely. And then perhaps most importantly, both in terms of your own English use, but that of your learners, aim to go beyond will. I know that you're always keen to have recommendations for books, particularly, that are helpful for us to understand the grammar we're teaching. And these three, Aitken's Teaching Tenses, Parrott's Grammar for English Language Teachers, and Scrivener's Teaching English Grammar, I think all are very useful in terms of thinking about future forms and other areas of English grammar. What they all do is focus on meaning. They present contexts through which the meanings can be expressed clearly. And certainly in the case of Parrott, he has some very useful analysis of the kind of errors that students make with future forms. Of course, those aren't by any way, it's not a conclusive list of texts that you could read. I've included here a few more, including that book on evidence-based teaching, which talks about deductive and inductive learning at different levels. Plus, in my reference to using reasons for explaining grammar use, Danny Norrington-Davis and also Richard Chin is co-author their book, Teaching Grammar from Rules to Reasons. If you found today's session useful, and I hope you have, it's only one of very many sessions that are available for pro members of the Gallery Teachers community. It is a community. I very much enjoy attending these events myself, as they enable me to learn all the time. So if you'd like more of the same with the very many different speakers who work for Gallery Teachers, then I would certainly recommend you signing up for pro membership, which also gives you access to other useful tools, such as safeguarding courses with an annual refresher, but also usefully access to Gallery Teachers' own chat GPT-4 AI bot. Thank you very much indeed.